I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to this special edition of I Mix What I Like right here, BPM. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. And I wanted to take a quick moment to do just a shorter video around something, starting with this very powerful discussion that I just got to listen to, that if you haven't heard, you should go listen to, and the link will be in the show description. Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, and Dr. Orisanmi Burton, talking about Dr. Burton's forthcoming and existing work, and some brilliantly fascinating discussion around prisons, revolution, George Jackson, and a little bit with Dhoruba Bin-Wahad that I want to play a little bit here, and then talk about one of the articles that they reference, which is really an interview that George Jackson gave not long before he was assassinated. So let's start with Dr. Burton on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Shout out to all of them and this fantastic platform and this amazing discussion that is really, really powerful. So we're just going to check out a few minutes of it, talk about this interview with George Jackson, and then keep it moving. So let's get into it. So just quickly, again, a lot of the work, and we're picking up here in this part of this conversation where Professor Burton is being asked to talk about some of his research, and he's starting with his work around Dhoruba Bin-Wahad, some of which he's talked about here. They get into more of it in this discussion, but I'm just wanting us to listen to this little excerpted and edited and sort of reduxed transition or segue or point of departure that Dr. Burton does, or that they perform here, starting with a discussion of Dhoruba Bin-Wahad. So here we go.
So essentially, Dhoruba was imprisoned for the attempted murder of two NYPD patrolmen. That's something that happened in 1971. He had always maintained that he didn't do that. He's in prison since 71. He's convicted of that specific act in 73. This is the same time that the Watergate scandal is unfolding or cascading.
Just quickly, is anybody watching, or has anybody watched the newly concluded or recently concluded series on one of these platforms with Woody Harrelson playing E.L. Hunt, across from forgot the actor's name, playing G. Gordon Liddy, and about their role in the Watergate break-in? Fascinating stuff. And it's wild to be hearing this interview shortly after just watching that series and all that it alludes to, particularly in terms of Hunt and the Kennedy assassination, what happened in real life to Hunt's wife. Fascinating stuff. But to think that on the other side of all of that Watergate scandal and attention and focus is what's being discussed here. So let's come back to it. I just want to stop there real quick and get that. Let's pick it back up.
Media, Pennsylvania, of an FBI office that reveals COINTELPRO also. That happened in 71, I believe. So he saw a news broadcast that mentioned COINTELPRO. So he wrote a letter to his lawyer saying, I bet you this is how they got me. And so ultimately they decide to sue the government. It's a protracted lawsuit that takes decades, and it eventually results in his release. But it also results in the release of over 300,000 pages of state documents. And I'm honored to say that they shared many of those documents with me. And among this massive archive, there's a stack of documents related to Prizax. Prizax is a portmanteau, meaning it's a combination of different words. So it's the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, also known as the Extremist Revolutionary Terrorist and Subversive Activities in Penal Institutions Program. It was officially launched in 1974. Interestingly enough, Dhoruba's files, there's a stack of Prizax files. They actually begin on August 21st, 1970, with a different program called the Black Extremists and Penal Institutions Program. The fact that they were in one stack and sort of like stapled together suggests that this is a continuity. So officially, Prize Acts begins in 1974, but it's a continuation of a different, specifically anti-black prison, anti-black, anti-radical prison program that began on August 21st, 1970. Now, folks might know that that is exactly 1 year to the day before George Jackson was killed, which
Message.
thing it seems like a significant sort of, let's call it a coincidence.
So yeah, that is a fascinating coincidence. So just again, track what is being said here. Now I've reduced this and edited it to get this little piece into a 3.5 minute or so segment. So you got to go check out the entire discussion because it's fascinating. And what the millennials, what the Mac Capitalism crew are able to do in eliciting responses from their guests is really well displayed in this discussion with Dr. Burton. But remember so just trace it here. So Dhoruba's locked up early, was it 70, somewhere 70, right? He's locked up, accused of BLA activities. He's in prison when the March or May of 1971, one of the M's, I think, May 8th, March 8th, one of the M's, 1971, Media, Pennsylvania, the anti-war activists break into the FBI office and in the process of trying to destroy draft records, end up discovering all these documents around the counterintelligence program. Dhoruba's locked up, hears about this, says to Bob Boyle, I believe they're talking about, yo, Bob, I bet this is how they got me. And in the process of proving that, release all of these documents, which end up talking about the prize sacks, that operation that Dr. Burton breaks down. And when he goes into more in this conversation than I think he does it somewhat with me, but more in this conversation here with about all of the different, it reminds of, again, the Who Killed George Jackson joint. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but the Who Killed George Jackson discussion of all of these different entities and agencies and operations going on all at once that point to this very specific anti-black, anti-radical effort to destroy movements occurring in and outside of prison. And then, of course, is this coincidence? Just like Dr. King is assassinated 1 year to the day after his Riverside Church speech, George Jackson is killed 1 year to the day after this prize sacks endeavor was concretized and put officially into existence. Fascinating. Let's keep going.
What I find really fascinating is that there's a consensus, right, between the revolutionary left. People like George and Dhoruba and Jalil Muntakim and many others, there's a consensus between them and right-wing reactionaries like those I mentioned a moment ago, specifically around the understanding that what is unfolding is a war and that prisons play a key role in that war, right? So you've got people on the left saying we're revolutionaries and we're engaged in revolutionary struggle through the prison. You've got people on the right saying these people are revolutionaries and they're engaged in revolutionary struggle through the prison. But that sort of consensus gets drowned out by this sort of bloodless liberal narrative of like prison rebellions as spontaneous combustion because people are tired of being treated badly.
So that last part there, so in 3.5 minutes, we get so much deliciousness to deal with and work with. So you have to go listen to this entire discussion, really all of Mac Capitalism stuff. And by the way, this is something I've wanted to start doing a little bit more as I've been encouraging more outlets who we know engage BPM to build work that they do off of work that we do. I want to start doing the same, more of the same with outlets that I know I pay a lot of attention to. So in other words, as we would build content off of watching some mainstream news outlet or some mainstream film. I want to start producing as much content or building at least more content from what those on our side of the barricades, as Dhoruba puts it, are producing. And there's so much happening and there's so much potential for that. This just happened to be a very timely and easy way relatively for me to do that. So we get already just this thread that Professor Burton is showing, drawing for us from Dhoruba to COINTELPRO to the anti-war break-ins, all of that, to the revealing of all these documents, to the odd timing of assassinations, and then to this last point here. So for all that I've been building off of, to the point I'm just making, Christopher Mott's discussion of the woke imperium, this is exactly what Professor Burton just highlighted right there, is exactly the point that I've been trying to get at, and demonstrates perfectly how it's playing out both then and still today. That is, and he does more. I truncated it a little bit for time, but if you listen to the whole thing, what Professor Burton is talking about is on both the left and the right, obviously for different reasons with different analyses and interpretations, both sides are clear what's happening inside the prison, those struggles inside the prison, particularly at that time that they're talking about here, is a revolutionary effort. It's an attempt to redefine the function, as we're going to look at here in just a second, as George Jackson put it, of what the prison is meant to play. And it's looking to revolutionize relationships of various races and classes within the prison system, and then the prison systems itself and its relationship to society as a whole. The left are clear on that, Burton points out. The right is clear on that, as Burton points out. Those who are less clear and who work so mightily to confuse the issue are those in the middle, the liberals, who reduce the situation in the context of prison uprisings to spontaneous rebellions that are immature, born out of nothing, that there's no legacy or history or context to be applied. It's just a bad situation. They're being treated badly. They rise up and that's it. Whether it's in the prisons, whether it's George Floyd's summer a couple of summers ago, whatever it is, and we have the recycling of the, why are they so upset? What's going on? What could it be? It's the same thing. And then that narrative takes hold. And this is, again, a thread that I know we've been at BPM trying to deal with since we've been here. There is a rebranding of these histories. There are even those who theoretically or nominally champion these histories, but present them in the most liberal and defanged, depoliticized ways. It becomes, as we were talking about in the Who Killed George Jackson discussion, what George said himself of Soledad Brother. You've erased, you've omitted, you've extracted all of the warrior, all of the militancy, all of the radical analysis, and provided a liberal presentation of an incarcerated man so that white liberal audiences will be more likely to buy the book and support my and maybe some others' freedoms. I thought it's such a brilliant point that I'm doing a disservice to. That's why you got to listen to the whole thing. But one thing that one of the other good things that Burton brings up in this discussion is an interview conducted on May 16th and June 29th of 1971 with George Jackson by Karen Wald, published initially in Cages of Steel and is here in History as a Weapon. I'll put the link. It will also be in the show description as well. But in part, what this is talking about, and Burton makes this point in his discussion on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, what George is talking about here initially is a need for us to understand and to adjust our understanding of what the prisons are here to do as a function. So he's asked initially, could you comment on your conception of revolution? And George answers, the principal contradiction between the oppressor and the oppressed can be reduced to the fact that the only way the oppressor can maintain his position is by fostering, nurturing, building contempt for the oppressed. By the way, that is my initial approach in my own media analysis and work. That what is behind the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance. It's behind the condemnation of films like Spike Lee's Malcolm X and others that we were talking about on Earn Your Liberation just this morning. That I do understand, as George points out, that the principal contradiction between the oppressor and oppressed can be reduced to the fact that the way the oppressor maintains his position is by fostering, nurturing, and building contempt for the oppressed. How do you build contempt for the oppressed? By constantly rebranding and representing the history, images, contexts, identities, experiences of the oppressed in ways that reaffirm the colonizer and the colony itself, and reaffirm the inequality that exists, and then or even reaffirms pathways to address these conditions that don't actually, as Fred Hampton said, answer questions that don't answer, and ask questions that don't answer, look for answers that they don't answer, and what did he say? Questions that don't question, answers that don't answer, something like that. But the point is that that's so much of the goal right now. That things, continuing with Jackson, that things get out of hand after a while. It leads to excesses that we see, and the excesses are growing within the totalitarian state here. The excesses breed resistance. Resistance is growing. The thing grows in a spiral. It can only end one way. The excesses lead to resistance. Resistance leads to brutality. The brutality leads to more resistance. And finally, the question will be resolved with either the uneconomic destruction of the oppressed or the end of oppression. The question will be resolved with either the uneconomic destruction of the oppressed or the end of oppression. These are the workings of revolution. It grows in spirals, confrontations, and I mean on all levels. The institutions of society have buttressed the establishment, so I mean all levels have to be assaulted. He's still crediting, despite some of what was discussed in that Who Killed George Jackson discussion, Huey Newton with the founding of the modern prison movement. But here's what Burton talks about in this discussion with Mac Capitalism. And one point I would want to highlight here. Jackson says, well, we're all familiar with the function of the prison as an institution serving the needs of the totalitarian state. We've got to destroy that function. The function has to be no longer viable in the end. It's one of the strongest institutions supporting the totalitarian state. We have to destroy its effectiveness, and that's what the prison movement is all about. What I'm saying is that they put us in the concentration camps here, the same as they do put people in the tiger cages or strategic hamlets in Vietnam. The idea is to isolate, eliminate, liquidate, and the dynamic sections of the overall movement, the protagonists of the movement. And we've got to prove what we've got to do is prove this won't work. We've got to organize our resistance once we're inside, give them no peace, turn the prison into just another front of the struggle, tear it down from the inside. Understand? He goes on to talk more about, I'm not going to belabor this too much, but you know, again, it's something that should be read and considered more by more. Jackson talks, I think, importantly about the value and role of the guerrilla and guerrilla warfare. It's, as he says here, a new type of warrior who's developed out of conflicts in the third world countries, doesn't fight for glory necessarily. The guerrilla fights to win. And he connects very much this struggle here and what he's attempting to those of Cuba, Vietnam, Algeria, saying there's never going to be a moment's peace for anyone associated with the establishment, any place where I'm at. He says something also. I want to come back to first of all, he says something here. You talk about being prescient. Wow, this was really deep. So this is a couple years before Salvador Allende is assassinated. or is killed. First, I thought it's interesting that Jackson talks about in the years past, every time a black prisoner would achieve an intellectual breakthrough and begin to relate our situation to the situation of Cubans, say, or the Vietnamese or Chinese, anywhere else in the third world, well, these prisoners would be quickly assassinated. And I think that's something, again, to remember, even on the outside and in today's context, what happens to the ideas, at least, of internationalism and radical solidarity. But check this out here. This is a fascinating, prescient statement. He's asked about Salvador Allende in Chile and what he sees happening there. And remember, this is 71. Allende is killed in 73, September 11th. Jackson says they were appeasement. He's talking about the victories in the courts in Chile. They were an appeasement. Allende, the thing that happened with Allende, look, it was not a peaceful revolution. That's deception. Allende is a good man, but what's going on in Chile is just a reflection of the national aspirations of the ruling class. You will never find a peaceful revolution. Nobody surrenders their power without resistance. And until the upper class in Chile is crushed, Allende could at any time be defeated. No revolution can be consolidated under the conditions that prevail in Chile. Blood will flow down there. Either Allende will shed it in liquidating the ruling class, or the ruling class will shed his whenever it decides the time is right. Either way, there's no peaceful revolution. And wasn't he right? I mean, where is he wrong? Especially with what happened there. He makes an important point here in talking about Jonathan Jackson when asked about his brother who was killed the year before. And I think he makes an important point here when he says that Jonathan took a calculated risk. Some people say that makes him a fool. I say this was sort of the sort of courage that caused men of his age to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in somewhat different settings. The difference is that Jonathan understood very clearly who his real enemy was. The guy who gets the Congressional Medal usually doesn't. Now, who's the fool? Personally, I bear his loss very badly. It's a great burden upon my soul, but I think it's imperative. We owe it to him never to forget why he did what he did. I think that's a good point to make. He also says some important things here again about coming back to this issue of armed struggle. And it's something that, again, comes up in our discussion and in the book, Who Killed George Jackson? And it's something that comes up in discussions of in a variety of ways all the time today. And it doesn't always necessarily happen in the context of armed struggle being the focal point. It could be any form of radicalism that goes beyond the Democratic Party or that which the liberal elite and sort of the consensus, nonprofit consensus of activism finds acceptable. But Jackson says here, the revolution must proceed at all levels. But this is precisely what makes the tactics necessary, and far too many self-proclaimed revolutionaries have missed the point on this score. And he's talking specifically about the importance of the tactically of guerrilla warfare, which he's clear is not the end all and be all and will not be in and of itself enough, but is as he argues, a core component. Such tactics as Jonathan represent a whole level, an entire dimension of struggle, which has almost always been missing from the so-called American scene. And while it is true that armed struggle in and of itself can never achieve revolution, neither can the various forms of activity. Neither can the various other forms of activity. And while it is true that the armed struggle in and of itself can never achieve revolution, neither can the various other forms of activity. The covert armed guerrilla dimension of the movement fits hand in glove with the overt dimension. The two dimensions can and must be seen as inseparable aspects of the same phenomenon. Neither dimension can succeed without the other. And this is why, as we're going to talk about next week in our Guerrilla Intellectual University discussion through several subsequent weeks of Blood in My Eye, George Jackson is very clear that there needs to be an armed wing, a political wing, and an underground press that all must work to bring this all about. But more to the point, I think the situation is due to there having been a strong resistance to the whole idea of armed struggle on the part of much of the movement's supposed leadership, particularly the white leadership up to this point. I hear them arguing, contrary to history, logic, just plain common sense and everything else, that armed struggle is unnecessary, even counterproductive. I hear them arguing in the most stupidly misleading fashion imaginable that the overt dimension of the movement can bring off revolution on its own. This is the sheerest nonsense, and leaders who engage in such a babble should be discarded without hesitation. We may advance a simple rule. The likelihood of significant social change in the United States may be gauged by the extent to which the covert, armed guerrilla aspect of the struggle is developed and consolidated. If, on the other hand, this leadership is able to successfully do what amounts to the work of the state, that is to say, convince most people to shy away from armed struggle and to isolate those who do undertake to act as guerrillas from the mass of support which should rightly be theirs, then the revolution will be forestalled. Just lastly here, I think it's important in this interview that Jackson says he's never been an anti-communist and that he was attracted to communism initially just from seeing from his prison cell the impact of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 on those in power here in the United States. And he said, look, if they don't like it, then I like it. It must be good. And that's, he says, what led him to take seriously the study of socialism. And then he also reminds us that the power of the Cuban Revolution, not only in presenting a powerful critique of capitalism and a proponent of socialism or communism, reminded us, as he said here, as he described it, to consider the myth of invincibility. You know, the idea of the U.S. military invincibility was just completely destroyed by the Cuban Revolution. The U.S. supported Batista with rockets and planes. Everything was needed, and he still lost. He was destroyed by guerrilla warfare. Anyway, and as he ends here, I can wrap up myself for this discussion with what George says here. I'd like to say that the establishment is never going to be persuaded into giving us real power. It's never going to be tricked into. It's never going to feel guilty and change its ways. The only way we're ever going to get power we need to change things is by taking it over the open, brutal, physical opposition of the establishment. And it's terrifying, it's uncomfortable, it's, at least for me, speaking for myself, but it's not something that I think can be argued as being incorrect. But as Malcolm X said, if it can be shown to be incorrect, that the guerrilla and armed wing is not necessary, I'd love to see it. And I'd love to see it occur just through a political process, which is why I openly advocate the after-party approach to electoral politics and other forms of political activism and organizing, so that we can make the world better and hopefully, likely, as would be my preference, avoid what George, I think, is unfortunately accurate in advocating. But either way, I just think it's fascinating to consider, and particularly in light of that brilliant conversation between Orisanmi, Burton, and Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Big shout out to them once again. And definitely, if you haven't already, please go check that out. The link to that and to the George Jackson interview I just read from are in the show description. We'll be back with GIU next week to get into Blood in My Eye. More, I cannot wait. I cannot wait. And for members, please do check out the Who Killed George Jackson discussion. And thank you for your membership and patronage. And we'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and throughout the BPM platform. Peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks again.